Hey, it's Annika, and welcome to the Nutritional Mental Health Podcast. Today I'm interviewing the intuition dietitian. Her name is Steph, and she is so wonderful. Basically, we are going to be talking a lot about how to cultivate bodily intuition with ADHD and how to understand fullness cues, hunger cues, and how to actually cultivate those different cues for us. And I talk a lot about my experience with eating, and honestly, she helps me learn a lot of different things here too. If you are watching this on YouTube, I sincerely apologize that you are not seeing any video because for some reason I cannot get the video off of Instagram. It's just not working in my editing software, which kind of sucks. But I do have all of the captions on the screen, so at least you're going to be able to follow along with it a little bit easier. All right, well, thank you so much for listening and enjoy the episode. And I would love to hear any comment about how it actually impacts you. How does ADHD impact you with your food cues? And what are some things that you've done to help as well? All right, well, let's get into the episode and see you at the end. Basically, we're just going to be here and chit-chatting about what our experiences with food are, how we can improve our bodily intuition with food, because let's be honest, we don't really have anything like that. So give a quick spiel about who you are, what you do.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Stephanie. I am a registered dietitian who initially specialized in intuitive eating, and over the last few years of serving a lot of clients and based on my own lived experience, kind of have niched it down to intuitive eating for neurodivergence. So I tackle specifically like breaking cycles of under and overeating, binge eating, disordered eating, and kind of just help people develop more consistent eating patterns in the context of their neurodivergence and help people facilitate building a little bit more of a health promoting eating pattern, but in a neurodivergent affirming way, because I'm sure a lot of neurodivergents can relate that like the majority of nutrition information out there feels very inaccessible. So that's kind of the work that I do with my clients, breaking under and overeating cycles and just kind of slowly building up to a more health promoting eating pattern. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Why don't you give a spiel just in case some of my followers are watching too?
Oh, yeah. So my name's Annika. I am an ADHD nutrition research expert. So basically, it just means I read lots of research on ADHD. Like my master's degree was in health psychology. And so I'm more of the like what do we do statistically to help our ADHD with food?
Right.
That's more of my expertise.
Yes. Which I feel like is such a dynamic duo between the two of us, because though I know how to read research, like it's not my favorite part of this work. And I'm definitely more in like the behavior change realm at this point. So it's nice to have a resource and colleague that I can refer people to or ask questions. I literally have asked questions to you before. So yeah, I feel like we're such a good duo between like the science, the statistics, and the behavioral side of eating as well.
Oh yeah.
Love.
It's really great.
Love.
Like meshing the two. But yes, so all of y'all who have questions, so we're going to be just chatting a little bit more about like behavior change, things to help our ADHD in general. But there is a question box if you look at the bottom to the right a little bit.
Ooh, that's
and
fun.
You all can add all the questions you want. We have a few questions that some of y'all had put in our stories, and we'll cover some of that too.
Yes.
So your questions can go there. Otherwise, always you can throw stuff in the little comment section too, and we will probably see it, but might not get to it.
Yeah.
So yes. So common experiences with ADHD and food. What is it for you? Because for me, it was more unintentional restriction, because it's hard for me to eat anything.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah, I would say that is one of the most common eating patterns that I see. It's the inconsistent or sporadic eating, right? Where it's like we're going too long without eating. We're not registering our body's cues, so we're missing some of those typical cues from our body to eat. We get hyper fixated, hyper focused on things, and like task switching can present barriers that make it hard, even when we do notice that we're hungry, to like actually stop what we're doing and go do that. Also, some other barriers for consistent eating that I've seen with neurodivergence in general just has to do with executive functioning and demand avoidance, and just some of the like hidden labor of like feeding yourself on a consistent basis. Like, I think a lot of people underestimate how much labor it takes, especially if it's something you're not used to doing. So yes, under eating is a very common eating pattern that I see, where like we're going long periods of time not eating until later in the day, or like having some days where you eat almost nothing and then the next day it's the opposite. But what I also see as a result of that kind of unintentional restriction is an overeating pattern that forms usually in the evenings, where you've gone all day without eating, you've ignored or not registered your cues, and now you're finally in a state where you can think about food and kind of the floodgates open, and then it's kind of an overeating event, or even binge eating. And then you pair that with some of the other like neurodivergent needs, like unmasking, stimulation, dopamine seeking, and like burnout, and all of those often exacerbate those binge eating behaviors as well. So those are the two kind of eating patterns I see, and I most commonly see them in a cycle where it's like some period of time where we're underdoing it and some period of time where we're overdoing it. I'm sure a lot of people watching can relate to that. That was my personal cycle as well, which is why if people aren't familiar who are watching, intuitive eating is this concept of like you listen to your body, it helps with binge eating, it's non-dieting, it's just like figuring out how to kind of eat in tune with your body. Well, I was a binge eater and I was like, oh, intuitive eating is the solution. Like, this is going to work. Like, everyone says this helps your binge eating. And I started trying it and it worked kind of, and it did help, but I was like, no one's talking about how hard this is. Like, no one's talking about how I really don't want to be thinking about food. No one's talking about how much of a struggle it is to even get myself to cook, period. Like, no one's talking about how even after I do all of this intuitive eating stuff, I feel like I'm binging just because I need oral stim. Like, there was so much that I felt was undiscussed in the intuitive eating space, and that's when I was like, oh, I fear that my neurodivergence needs to be addressed in this conversation. So yeah, that's a little bit about the most common eating patterns that I see. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I was thinking about was I hope that like we create basically like a intuitive eating for neurodivergence like thing.
Right.
Like so that like RDs can get trained in it essentially. Because like intuitive eating for ADHD is really, really important. Like any mental health,
Right.
ideally we're intuitively
Yep.
eating because we are so much more like susceptible to eating disorders.
Right.
Like that is where intuitive
Yes.
eating is really, really important.
Yes. Like, and specifically like binge eating, well, under eating and then binge eating are like more common in ADHDers than they are in the general population. And it's absolutely under discussed. I am currently in a like course work group with um Noreen, I can't remember her last name, but it's RDs for neurodiversity.
Yeah, I see that on my page.
Yes, yes. She does a lot about like the autism spectrum, RFID, which I don't specialize in. But there's a lot of discussions that have been happening about intuitive eating and like where it misses the mark for neurodivergence. And you're right, there needs to be a resource.
Yeah. Hopefully it becomes somehow maybe
Mental
you
note.
do it, or I don't
Mental
know.
note. Mental note.
But anyway, yeah. So the whole binging thing, like that's not my experience, but I know a lot of people with ADHD have that,
Yeah.
which is really hard.
Yeah.
So like for me, whenever someone like asks me, how do I like work through this? I'm like, I'm so sorry. I've never experienced it.
Yeah.
I have a hard time just eating, even if I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Like,
which
that's my hard thing.
A lot of the people that binge eat also have that struggle. Like, a lot of the binge eaters probably relate to those same struggles that you have when it comes to the unintentional restriction, and they don't realize it. And tackling that unintentional restriction will likely have a lot of positive benefits when it comes to the frequency and severity of their overeating. So I still think your lived experience is probably really relevant to them, because like, if you have a hard time eating consistently, that you're going to relate to the binge eaters who have those same struggles, at least for part of the day.
Yeah, for sure. I think for myself, what I've noticed is like basically like just like from talking to other people is that we tend to have like the three different areas. Like one is the unintentional restriction to binging. The other one is just overeating in general,
Mm-hmm.
because like you're just constantly overeating.
Yep.
And then the third is like the constantly undereating. Like
Yeah.
you're just unintentionally restricting your
Yep.
food because like you just feel
Yeah.
like you aren't hungry
Right.
or it's too much effort.
Right.
And what I've also been noticing a little bit is it seems that people who are more like ADHD with like autism and ADHD tend to fall more into that unintentional restriction aspect.
Yeah, because there's added layers in terms of like the barriers to consistent eating, right? When you think about like sensory sensitivities and like um more of those the ways that your processing influences the way that you perceive and interact with food. Definitely, I would say like ADHD tends to lean more in the restrictive, unintentional restriction um, category, and that's why RFID is so common and not talked
Yeah.
about nearly enough.
Yeah, for sure. I'm so grateful I don't actually have ARFID. I have a lot of like tendencies to that.
Yeah,
But I'm, yeah, so grateful it's not full blown ARFID.
yeah,
That's really hard to experience.
yeah.
Yeah. So for the binging aspect, or like the under eating and then overeating later on, I feel like one of the hardest struggles there is to understand when you're actually
Mm,
full. And maybe like that's just a conversation itself, like understanding when are we actually full,
right.
as well as like understanding when are we hungry.
Yeah. I and I'll tell you the 90% of the insight that I have as I'm answering these questions is like from my clients' lived experiences. Like there's not a lot of evidence out there outside of
Oh, there's
the
like
hundreds of
there's nothing in the research. Like
yeah,
this is what I try to find,
yeah,
and
you're like
there's
no.
nothing.
You're like I would know. I wouldn't be asking you if there was research because I would know. Um, so what was your question again?
How do we actually like cultivate those like
Cues.
yeah.
Absolutely. And someone asked that. Someone said interpreting bodily signals when your brain body connection's weak. So what I've noticed is hunger cues typically need to get tackled first in some way. But with obviously interoceptive differences, like people, neurodivergent people in general, may never have like really thriving hunger cues. However, hunger cues need a consistent eating pattern in order to thrive. So I always start there. I always start there. Even
Oh,
and
that's good.
I'll preface and say, neurodivergent folks tend to have interoceptive differences. We're not like we don't necessarily know what kind of the max level of like presentness of hunger cues will be for you specifically, but I do know if you're eating inconsistently, that's not an accurate measure of what your hunger and fullness cues are actually like. So a consistent eating pattern first helps to nurture more like abundant and consistent and readable hunger cues. And then once we're there eating more consistently, then we can kind of gauge like, are you noticing your hunger? What does hunger mean to you? Because a lot of times it's just we and this I feel like this goes for a lot of bodily cues with neurodivergence is like it's kind of like this no one like explains what it's supposed to feel like. It's just you're supposed to know intuitively, right? Like hunger, like you're supposed to feel it and you're supposed to know, but that's really not the case for a lot of us that experience those interoceptive differences. So I've noticed that like identifying what your typical signs of like needing food are, which for a lot of people is like brain fog, irritability, increased anxiety, like lack of focus, like those things, sometimes we can actually find other signals to lean on from your body. And then outside of that, you might just need some level of like structure that is a schedule. And like we aren't depending primarily on your body's cues. We're depending also on some level of like an eating schedule or something if that feels aligned. But I have very rarely actually encountered that. Most of the time, when me and my clients focus specifically on consistent eating, they get to a point where they kind of do sense their hunger at least a little bit and enough to facilitate more consistent eating. And then we can talk about fullness cues. because as long as you're under eating, your body's not really processing fullness cues as accurately. So when you're going into every meal dysregulated, you're way less likely to notice those fullness cues.
That is so good.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't even tackle fullness cues or trying to listen and honor your fullness until my clients are eating more consistently. It's also, I love to compartmentalize stuff. So like I try to make sure that my clients are like only focusing on one thing at a time so that they're not overwhelmed. So it's like, put your blinders on. We're doing hunger. We're doing consistent eating. We're seeing what's going on there. We're figuring out an eating routine that works for you. And then when you sit down to eat, you're actually regulated and not feeling crazy and feeling so like out of body and dysregulated that you can't like register your fullness. And then another thing to consider with fullness cues is that they are kind of slow to set in. So for a lot of binge eaters, overeaters, when they're going into their meals dysregulated, they're also going into them quickly and they're like crushing their meal really fast and their fullness cues are like 10 minutes behind them. So by the time they finish eating, 10 minutes later, they're like, whoa, I'm uncomfortable. And they didn't realize that they kind of blew past that level of fullness, but it's because they needed to take their time and slow things down. So a lot of the work we're doing with fullness cues is actually just like creating time and space in their meals and utilizing whatever like brain related tools help them slow down, whether that's like optimizing some level of stimulation with TV or phone or stims. Or I have a client yesterday who was like, I realize I just like to stand when I eat. And I'm like, period. And it like helps her slow down. So we just kind of explore tools for slowing down, and then we can kind of start to notice fullness cues a little bit more. And then, yeah, but we still might be blowing past fullness cues if there's other contributors to overeating on board, like emotional eating, again, needs for stimming. So there's a lot of kind of boxes we have to check to get to a place where we're honoring our fullness.
It's almost like a flow chart that we get to learn as we get to learn our specific body.
Exactly. That's a great visual that maybe I should work on making, because I feel like it is literally a flow chart.
You should. You 100% should.
Okay, maybe I will. Freebie alert.
Also, a quick reminder, if y'all have questions, I see a few people put it in the question box.
Yes.
It's hard to go back and look at all your questions, so make sure you put it in the question box, which is down to the right on the bottom. Anyway, I just had some thoughts as you were talking, but the starting cues, or like the hunger cues, you said something, and my working memory is horrible, and I will just rewatch this when I put it on my page after that. But it was the
the hunger cues rely on consistent eating patterns?
Oh, yeah. And then you talked about like time and stuff. Like that is exactly what I have to do.
Yeah.
I have my eating windows.
Yep.
And I tell myself I have to eat during these times.
Yep.
No matter what, I have to eat something, even if I don't want to, even if it feels like I don't need any, even if I'm in the middle of a task. But the eating window helps with the task switching, because it's not like I have to eat at this time.
Yeah. Exactly. I have a lot of clients who use like eating windows, and then they also use apps like Finch. I'm sure you've heard of Finch.
Oh yeah.
Before.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Finch, Eat Well is another one. But yeah, an eating window, I think that's a great recommendation, because it's less like concrete, so it gives you more leeway for the task switching. And does give you a little bit more leeway in case you're like feeling really averse to food at the beginning of that window. At least you have a little bit more time to like get comfortable with the idea.
Yeah. Like that's the other thing. Just because task switching is so hard, but then like
so hard.
Yeah, I honestly hate it. And then for me with other things with food, texture obviously is a really hard thing for me. Maybe not obviously, but now y'all know it is a hard thing for me.
Yeah.
Like it has to be the right texture, or like if it all of a sudden turns wrong in my mouth, it feels like my throat actually closes up and I'm gonna like eject it.
Yeah, that's also why like everyone's tolerance for kind of like eating when you don't want to, it varies quite a bit. And why I'm constantly having to ask my clients, like, how does that feel to like eat when you're not hungry? Like, what are your thoughts about that? Because the last thing you want to do, and this should always be kind of like something we're keeping a pulse on, is like creating aversive experiences with food, because the more aversive experiences with food, the harder it's going to be to eat consistently. I also see a lot of, and this comes from internalized ableism in diet culture and in all like the wellness space in general, is like, oh, I need to be eating these specific types of foods in these specific types of ways in order for them to be healthy, and I don't like these foods, but it's what I should be eating, so I'm going to force myself to eat it. And then that forcefulness like just causes them to have worse and worse relationship with food, and then they don't want to eat anything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. The whole, oh yeah. I mean, that's like another conversation. It's
Yeah.
like how diet culture makes eating harder for us.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Like,
Well, and then we get analysis paralysis. Well, and then also we have a really hard time existing in the gray area of anything, right? Like where a lot of us are like these all or nothing, black and white thinkers, for a lot of us are at least. And diet culture has made us believe that like, you know, your food choice is either good or bad, and like there's no nuance or gray area in that. So I have a lot of clients who have analysis paralysis with their eating, where like they also are inconsistently eating because they're trying to eat healthy, but they can't they can't make the decision, and there's too many like options, and they don't know how to make the right decision. So then they just get paralysis about it, and then they're like, nah, I'm just not going to eat. And they feel like not making a food decision is better than making the wrong one. But I would argue the only wrong thing is to not eat when you know you need to. Outside of that, and fed literally is best, like from a health perspective. So, but yeah, I see that analysis paralysis of things often as well, because diet culture is so black and white with things.
yeah. And then adding in, like you said, our tendencies toward black and white thinking in general. Like,
And then if you're already struggling to eat consistently, and then you're approaching this eating event hungry, dysregulated, and likely your executive functioning is like on the floor because you're underfueled and dysregulated, making food decisions feels like so hard.
oh gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's like where I find having a list of foods, especially
Yes.
breakfast foods for me, because like breakfast is so hard.
That's the hardest.
But like, because our cognitive ability is honestly like we just have so many things going on in our brain. And so we need to reduce as much of that as possible so that we can actually make decisions. Like, decisions are so hard.
Yes.
So having a list of things to eat takes away that like just thing that you had to think about.
Right.
So you don't have to like make it up.
Right.
It's like,
and that's also why that compartmentalization that I talked about earlier, where it's like my clients tend to do really well when I give them permission to abandon all food related goals and focus on putting something in their body within 3 hours of waking. Like, and that's like the only, I'm like, literally nothing else matters. Like, just focus on that. And then we like come up with a list of options for that moment. And then they get consistent with that. And then we build from there.
and that's like exactly what we need to do. I feel like that's another area that a lot of us just have a hard time with. We feel like we can do everything
all at once. You can't.
Yep.
You can't. And I mean, and sure, there's people that can, but like, if you've tried that over and over, you've tried that, and it's never worked, maybe it's time to consider micro baby steps,
perhaps
tiny steps. Yeah.
I feel like my husband, every single time I try to like do a huge goal or something, he's like, Annika.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
Are you sure that's how you want to go about it? You're like, yeah, I can do it.
I can do everything. I can completely change my life. This is not a huge goal. And then, no, it's a big goal.
Yeah. Every time.
Oh, yeah, that is, yes. We're just like not the best at estimating ourselves. I think that's kind of what it comes down to.
Yeah. Like accurately assessing our bandwidth. Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
I mean, that was literally me today. Like I have a few projects I need to get done. And they're kind of on a short time span. And one of them is like this 7 email sequence. And I'm like, okay, I wrote in my to-do list email sequence. Like that's not 7 different emails. I wrote one task as that. And then I looked at it and I was like, I'm so overwhelmed. And then I deleted it and wrote one email. And I was like, oh, I feel so much better. Like why do I do that to myself even now? But at least there's a level of awareness where I can go back to the drawing board now and go, I don't have the bandwidth for that. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
But when you are this is one of the biggest struggles with a lot of my clients too, is how much internalized ableism that they are living with and how unaware of it they are. Because it's one thing to have that internalized ableism and then go, oh, that's ableism. Let me pivot. It's another thing to like not even realize that the dialogues that you're entertaining and all of this guilt and shame that you have about not being able to do things in a certain way is like informed by an oppressive system and doing you absolutely no good. So that's one of the biggest things I'm working through with my clients on a day-to-day basis, is just helping them like reconsider their expectations. Yeah.
I mean, this is where I really appreciate conversations like this, because y'all know that we are like some of the experts in this, and yet we still struggle so much.
Yeah.
Like you can know all the things
all the things
and still have, because it is a disability.
Right. No,
like,
truly.
It is.
And a lot of times people or clients will ask me, oh, like, how have you gotten to a point where it's just like so managed? And I'm like, one, slow down. Savannah, slow down. Second of all, I just have a lot of privilege. Like that's also what it is for me. Like I own my own business. I have flexibility in my hours. I have flexibility with the amount of work that I take on at a given time. Like I had access to therapy for long enough to help me understand my cycles of hyperactivity and burnout so that I could prevent them. I also moved to a desolate area where I'm not overstimulated and like can go touch the grass when I need to. Like I have a lot of privilege that allows me to like manage. But that's just like not the case for everybody. And if you need more tools and more accommodations, then that's what you need. That's the struggle with the internalized ableism, is clients do not want to own their needs. There's a lot of guilt and shame for having them in general.
Yeah. Wow, that was a good soapbox right there.
Thank you.
I mean, because same. So much of my ability is like, honestly, the fact that I'm living with another person who cares about me.
Oh my God, no, I should have said that. My boyfriend is so helpful. He does like all the dishes. He does all the laundry. Like there's things that like he makes my life a lot easier. So yes, agreed.
Yeah. Like seriously, I think it's also like that cueing, which is where like living with another person is helpful if you have ADHD and you struggle with eating.
Yeah.
Because even when I have to eat between these times, if I don't have another person around me, it's like an external motivation part, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Like
the
we just
cueing
need
is huge. Oh my God, the cueing is huge. The amount of times my boyfriend's been like, okay, we're gonna go do this, and I'm like, really? He's like, yeah. I'm like, okay. And then I do it, and I'm like, this isn't that bad. I'm like, I'm glad you told me to get up and to help, like, do it with you. Thank you. Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
Or like he actually helps me understand my hunger cues, actually, which is really, I mean, he's wonderful. I love him so much.
Yeah.
But like I'll tell him like, oh my gosh, I feel so brain foggy right now, and he's like, Annika, when did you eat? I'm like, break. Well, you're right.
Good point.
Or I'll be like really irritable, and he'll be like, when did you eat?
That's men's like number one response. Or like, you need some water. You should drink some water. You should drink some water. Which, when you're dating or married to someone with ADHD, like that's probably not a bad suggestion. Do you just need some water? You're like, wait, maybe actually.
Maybe I do. Yup. He also helps me navigate a lot of the pathological demand avoidance aspects of eating.
Yep.
Like every so often I'm super curious about if anyone else has experienced this, but like sometimes when I'm eating, I'll feel like I literally can't eat anything else. Like if I put it in my mouth, I'll like, ugh,
Yeah.
can't. No matter what, like even if it's something I love.
Yep.
Like some days it just happens where I just
Yep.
can't. And
Yep.
then I'll like say like, "Oh my gosh, this is so stupid. I hate that I'm like this." And then he'll be like, "Yeah, it is stupid." And then I'll be, no, it's not. And then I can eat it.
You're like, wait a minute, that's rude. And he's like, that's my point. Like, we really do have like so much less compassion for ourselves than is necessary. That's also like the framework that I've taught all of my clients, because it's in the curriculum, but is the concept of compassionate problem solving and just being like super neutral about what your needs are. Um, and also like, instead of in those moments being like, oh, this is so stupid that I can't, like, this is such a stupid struggle, or this is so frustrating, being like, what is going on?
Mm.
Like, why am I feeling like this? Like, is it the food? Is it the texture? Is there something that happened in my day? Like, can I really not find an explanation and I just need to figure out how to get something else into my body? But like, having that neutral curiosity and using compassion in that moment, a lot of times, and look, like, he induced compassion for you. That's what he did. Said it is
Exactly.
stupid, and you were like, it's not. Like,
And
that's
then he's like,
really neat. Like,
After I
this is
started
really
eating, then
hard
he looked at
for
me.
me. Yeah, you're like, great. Um, so
Oh,
yeah, that's a really great example, actually.
yeah. I feel like another weird thing that I struggle with is sometimes it gets boring. Just like even bringing up the thing or like chewing gets boring, which
Absolutely. Yeah,
is
you do
so
have
annoying.
you definitely do have R-fitty vibes. Like, you have definitely like some symptoms that are similar to it, at least. So
Yeah,
I could see how like consistent eating could be like a really big challenge for you. Do you have like a lot of kind of safe food options that are like not chewy, things you don't have to chew?
I definitely
What's
resort to liquid
I was gonna
nutrition
say, what's your
a lot.
liquid nutrition game? You got liquid nutrition on deck, or
Oh yeah.
yeah,
I make myself a lot of
yeah,
smoothies. Like
love a smoothie.
it's just and well that was a question that somebody had in a story, just like what are some good recipes to use? And liquid nutrition is honestly so great. Like what I do is I do soy milk and Greek yogurt and cocoa powder, peanut butter, and maple syrup. Blend that all together.
Love,
Put a straw in it,
love,
and I drink that.
love.
And I will just drink that. And it's like 600 calories, which is great because I
Yeah,
need calories.
yeah, yeah. I
So,
I have a post on my feed. You have to scroll a little bit down, but it's about liquid nutrition and smoothies. And I have my smoothie recipe template. If anyone's watching this and you want it, just DM me and I'll send it to you. But I have like a template that's basically like all the different food groups and how to basically turn a smoothie into a meal, and get some level of like complete nutrition from them. Smoothies are such valuable tools for
yeah,
my clients. Those, and just like meal replacement supplements, like oral supplements and things, which again, our internalized ableism starts to come up where they're like, well, I shouldn't need that long term. And it's like, what, we don't should on ourselves here. We just give ourselves what we need. And if something like Ensure is going to give your body the nutrition it needs to function, then like that's what you need. or we
exactly.
can or we can fight tooth and nail against these needs for stretch out this struggle for months to years,
Yeah.
denying our needs, right? Like, it's just, and here's the thing with specifically with consistent eating is like the most important thing is to break the cycle of under eating in whatever way you can, because the more you undereat, the worse your symptom presentation, the worse the food aversions, the worse the food anxiety, the worse the executive functioning, the worse the decision fatigue. Like, so whatever you need to do to get nutrition into your body in some way, shape, or form, like, and releasing expectations of what that looks like, the more likely you're going to be to like be able to build more consistent eating patterns, and like eventually maybe start cooking a meal or having less liquid nutrition if that's a goal of yours, which it doesn't need to be, but it can be. But a lot of times we like look too far ahead at what we want our eating patterns to look like instead of looking at what we need in order to break these cycles.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Someone had a question about are smoothies okay because like they break down the fiber?
Oh yeah.
I'm 90%, like, correct me. As long as you're not juicing, you still have the fiber. It's just like your body. It's like your stomach when you blend it up.
It's like your mouth when you blend it
yeah,
up also.
Yeah.
Because your mouth is actually the part that does the majority of the like breaking down, the starches specifically. So yeah, the fiber is totally adequate in a smoothie. I will tell you though, because the majority of your like starch digestive enzymes, the amylase, actually are in your mouth, not in your stomach. If you're doing smoothies and you notice any type of like digestional distress from them, switching from a straw to a spoon can help mix the saliva a little bit more and get more of those digestive enzymes in your smoothie so that you're not experiencing like bloat or indigestion. So that is really all that I would say. But absolutely, the fiber is still adequate and useful, and all the health benefits that come from adequate fiber intake still are there when you have a smoothie.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. And then I feel like the last weird thing, I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but sometimes when I eat food and like I get to like that point, I will like start to get like an irrational amount of energy inside of my body where I like just like want to hit my plate or something like that.
I was just gonna say, do you feel like it was like heat or anger? Because I hear heat sometimes. I hear like anger, or I think a lot of times these symptoms.
Maybe it's unresolved anger. I know that is a emotion I do not experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably frustration. Like it's probably all of the things. I wouldn't be surprised if it's this like suppressed rage, because the again, like the PDA that's surfacing for you with eating, like there's got to be some rage in there with just the like frustration that this is something you have to do. I have a lot of clients
that I have to eat.
Yes, I have a lot of clients come to me and be like, like, can I just, like, I literally wish I could just be tube fed. Like, I do wish that. And I completely understand that need, like, that desire, because when you get to a certain point where, like, you and food are just, there's beef there. No pun intended. Yeah, so you're definitely not the only one that probably has that desire to, like, how do you usually handle that in that moment?
I just usually tell my husband I want to like hit my plate, and then he tells me, okay, hit the plate, and then I'm like, okay, I'm not going to now. Now it's been diffused.
He knows, yeah. That's so funny. Well, maybe you need to like do a little somatic release.
I might, honestly. Like, I feel like I should journal after this now. Figure out what the heck is going on.
This is a subcategory or I don't know, not subcategory, but a topic that I'm been getting increasingly curious about over the last year or so in talking to a lot of my clients is this like somatics and how I think intertwined they are with neurodivergence and our needs to like release energy. So I've been like recommending that a little bit more for clients and like referring them to a couple providers that I know that do different types of like somatics. Yes, I even heard that smashing fruit with a fork is not as good as eating the entire fruit. Oh, sorry, I got distracted. I thought that was about what I was saying. Anyways, yeah, like that literal physical like pent up energy sometimes needs to just be let out. Maybe you need a little pillow scream or a pillow punch.
I do. Maybe I do.
True. The Untamed Herbalist, I follow her. Her name's Amrit. She talks about this a lot. She talks about like hidden rage. She's more like a PTSD, CPTSD trauma provider, but she talks about like needing to punch a pillow or scream in a pillow. She also twerks for somatics a lot, so she like dances and things. And I'm like, she's onto something. She's definitely onto something. So yeah, do a little journal and see what you kind of need in those moments, so that, like, I think being curious, right? Like something's happening, something's surfacing.
Yeah. Something is.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Don't ignore it.
Wow, this is like
frustrated.
A therapy session for me on live. Great.
You're like, I have another question, so sometimes I do this.
All right, speaking of questions though, let's get into those. sure that y'all put questions into the question box because I will start going through them
Yes, let's do it.
like right now. So let's start off with this one here. Wait, if I tap it, do you see it?
No, you'll have to read it.
Oh, dang it. It says if I tap a question, people can see it. Oh, that's so annoying. Okay. Anyway, the question was, I like the idea of eating windows. How big of a window makes sense?
Great question. I think it depends on how many windows you have, right? Like, do you do 3, 4? What do you do?
I personally do three because more than that is harder for me.
Yeah.
Ideally, we're not just eating 3 meals
Yeah.
with ADHD. Like, ideally,
Yeah.
we're eating like
More
throughout the
than
day,
that.
but
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Most of my clients end up needing, and if you're an overeater, add a snack to this, at least one snack to my recommendation, but the majority need at least 3 meals, usually with 1 to 2 snacks as well. But I do have some clients who prefer to do four meals, like they split up their midday meal because that makes sense, or they do kind of like a smaller breakfast at like an appetizer like breakfast and then something like a few hours later because that makes sense. So I would say it depends on your wake window because you do want to spread this out across your wake window, and then 3 to 4 windows of time, a few hours. What are your windows, like 3?
yeah, like my windows are 2 hours.
Oh, okay.
So my window is about like because I usually wake up around 7, so it's like 7:30 to like 9:30 is my window, and then 11 to 1, and then 5 to 7.
Okay, yeah. So I would say 2 to 3 hour windows are pretty appropriate. And again, you would want to be basing that off of your wake windows. So a lot of times people ask me like, what time should I be eating lunch? And I'm like, I don't know. What time do you wake up? What time do you go to sleep? Like it has nothing to do with the time of day and everything to do with like how long you've been awake without eating. So yeah, I would say 2 to 3 hour window, 3 to 4 windows from when you wake up to when you go to bed. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The next one was ADHD and diabetes. Do you know anything about ADHD and diabetes?
I about the intersection between them, or I know a lot about diabetes. I worked in diabetes clinic.
I guess so. The question was ADHD and diabetes question mark.
Oh.
It's such a struggle. I forget to eat for like 12 hours and then forget to bolus and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Okay, I could see that. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like my recommendations are going to be very similar. Oh, I can see the question now. Such a struggle. I forget to eat for 12 hours, then forget to bolus. Yeah. Similar to what we talked about earlier about like figuring out how to just eat consistently in whatever way that makes sense. Because bolusing, oh, we got to get I don't know if they have like a reminder app or anything. But they might have to be like habit stacking or figuring out a way to be more consistent with the bolus. But for inconsistent eating, like if you're forgetting to eat for 12 hours, then definitely I would kind of put the blinders up there and focus on increasing the frequency of eating, because that's going to help with stabilizing your blood sugars. And that's a thing, right? Like I have a couple clients with like pre-diabetes or diabetes, and they get very overwhelmed with like their binge eating, and they're now supposed to be thinking about like blood sugar and like all this stuff. And I constantly am telling them that inconsistent eating patterns are to the detriment of your diabetes just as much as like making the wrong food choices. So like don't worry about the specifics and focus on a consistent eating pattern first, especially if you have type 1 diabetes or insulin dependent diabetes where you need to be dosing. I would definitely focus on how to create a more consistent eating structure by like slowly building up to it, and then worry about like more specific nutrition, blood sugar balancing stuff after that.
Hmm. That's really good advice in general. But yeah, like a lot of people with ADHD, we do have a higher incidence of diabetes. We don't know if it's like
Like what it's about.
like
Yeah.
why. There's a few like main theories. Like the one is ADHD just like tends to lead to behaviors that could induce
Yeah.
diabetes.
Yeah.
There's like some genes that are similar with ADHD and diabetes as well. It's so like just like with everything, it's probably both genetic and
Well,
behavioral.
and then when you think about like chronic illness rates in general and
Yeah.
like ADHD presentation and like the chicken or egg conversation about that, like I know diabetes is part of that conversation in terms of like trauma. So I'm sure there's a trauma conversation in here as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Is
it's
the
just
incidence
very
higher because
complicated.
someone said, is the incidence higher because sugar gives dopamine? I would argue no, because diabetes isn't just about like sugar consumption. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So I wouldn't say that it's, sugar intake amongst amongst ADHDers, yes, that's definitely something, but I don't think that that's what's causing the rates of diabetes to be.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say so either. In fact, what we actually see is that even though people with ADHD like they tend to eat more sugar than the general population, it's not increasing their ADHD symptoms. And so like really what that kind of means is that people with ADHD just might need more sugar
Yeah,
or they might need to eat more regularly,
right, right.
which
Which
is
is
why we say like eat at least 3 meals a day, ideally maybe 4 to 5.
this is why it's so funny because I feel sometimes like I'm just like saying the same things over and over, and I'm like, I hope people understand I'm not just saying this just to say it, but like this is why focusing on a consistent eating pattern is like the number one thing to start with, because like it's so hard to even interpret what else is going on when it comes to sugar cravings or whatever when your body is just like underfed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd also argue a other aspect would be people with ADHD just tend not to eat as many fibrous foods.
Oh, totally. Totally. Well, and then because a lot of nutrition information is so inaccessible, like a lot of us don't find it feeling feasible to be able to like implement nutrition principles and eat more fiber. Every time I have a client where we're inching our way towards talking about nutrition, there's always this like initial fear of like, well, I already know I don't like a lot of healthy foods, and I have the palate of a kid, and I know that like I'm not gonna be able to eat all these things. I'm not gonna be able to eat the fruits and vegetables, and it's like there's so much fear around it because they've only really ever been exposed to one way of healthy eating. So I would definitely agree with you on that like fiber intake is probably a lot lower.
Yeah. A similar question here is I went off sugar for at least 2 weeks and my emotions were all over the place. Can you explain? Do you have thoughts?
Um, I do, but I don't know how to word them. Do you have something initially that you want to say?
I mean, I guess it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit. So
Right.
sugar is our body's main source of energy.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that is what it is.
Yeah.
In general, like we don't want to overeat added sugars.
Yeah. And I'd be curious when the went off sugar, are you just referring to added sugars? Um,
Yeah, like
because
that
like
that
an
would be a
addiction
question.
to that.
Like it's really hard because personally I would just reduce sugar intake if you are working on that. Like like taking out sugar like completely
Yeah.
is a shock to your system.
Yeah.
It's a complete shock.
Yeah.
Like it can likely result in emotional dysregulation because your body is used to something. It's
Yeah.
used to having a consistent amount of a certain type of energy.
Yeah.
And then you take that energy away, and now your body's trying to reconfigure itself to figure out why am I not working the way I was working for a while?
Right.
Like, why is the person feeding me not
Yeah.
giving me what it
I
usually does?
usually does. Absolutely. Well, and then um also like I'd argue that cutting things out completely and someone said feels like an addiction detox. The thing about sugar is like it's not being detoxed. And there's no like, oh, after a certain amount of time you start to feel better. Like the likelihood of cutting something out completely inducing just inducing like a disordered relationship with that food where you just start to overeat it afterwards, it's pretty high. Like the majority of people who try to cut out sugar, especially for a temporary amount of time, like thinking that it'll be more like a detox, end up usually just craving it a lot more at the end. And once they give themselves permission to have it again, they feel very out of control around it. So especially with ADHDers and the higher the higher prevalence of like binge eating and overeating behaviors, I really wouldn't recommend taking restrictive approaches to to decreasing things like sugar.
Yeah, I feel like that encapsulated pretty much
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I know someone asked about like sugars, like what are good sugars, bad sugars. Obviously, like sugars, it doesn't have morality, like food doesn't have morality.
Yeah.
Um, it's less of like quote unquote bad sugars and more of how much sugar. Like, and it's not
And
like
the
how much sugar, it's like
context,
added
right?
sugar too. Yeah.
Right. The context you're having it in also. Like it's because is your diet void of fiber? Are you pairing things with protein? Like there's a lot of other things to consider too outside of just like sure, added sugar is the thing we would want to be like looking at, and if we're going to decrease anything, it'd be decreasing the amount of added sugars. But there's still a place for added sugars in your diet, especially if you're pairing them with things like proteins and fiber, and overall having like a balanced diet.
Yeah. And that's what we see in the literature too. Like it's less of how much, honestly, unless like you're going over the recommended limits,
Yeah.
and more of how much are you having at one time.
Yep.
That,
Which is why
yeah.
focusing on inconsistent eating patterns is so helpful. Because that's the issue with most of my clients is they're like, I'm eating so much sugar. I'm like, well, you're eating so much sugar all at one time, right? That's actually, I don't know if you saw my post about the Oreos and the protein ice cream. Did you
I
see that
did,
one?
and it looks so good.
I posted like, oh, but adding 3 Oreos to your protein ice cream is unhealthy. And I said, I used to eat an entire container of Oreos in one sitting. I think I'll live.
Mhm.
And that I feel like also encapsulates this conversation about sugar is like, well, yeah, but it's not like adding a little bit of added sugar to something isn't where the harm lies. The harm lies in the fact that we're sitting down and feel so out of control around these foods that we don't know when to stop, don't know what context to eat them in to make ourselves feel comfortable and good. So yeah, that just
Yeah.
made me think of my post.
Well, if anyone just has like a desire to decrease their sugar intake, honestly, like that's the first thing you got just have to know. Like the most important thing is not having a lot of sugar at one time.
Yeah,
Like our
spread it out.
brain, yeah, just spread it out throughout your day before you try to decrease it
Yep,
in general.
yep,
And then maybe as you've been doing that, then maybe you can try to decrease a little bit of your sugar intake.
yep.
But uh, if any of y'all want to like know the like reason why it impacts ADHD. So when we binge, whether that's sugar or just overeating in general, over time that impacts our D2 receptor in our brain. So the D2 receptor is a dopamine receptor. We have a lot of dopamine receptors, but it's one of them.
Yeah.
And basically it just like makes us less sensitive to dopamine over time. So this is where again eating consistently is super duper important because then it can help kind of reverse a little bit of that.
Yeah. I love
Oh,
science.
it's just so good.
I also love when like I've found something to be so consistently true amongst my clients' lived experiences, and then I see a post of yours and you're like, here's a research article, and I'm like, see, I knew it. Like I'm like, yes, okay, like shout out to Annika for finding the science behind this because I knew it was there. I just didn't go looking for it myself.
Well, we've been talking for a while, and I know that you said that you have things to do. So before we end, if any of y'all resound a lot with Steph's stuff, she has a group that is called Ellie, and it's great, and y'all should probably just join it. But basically, it's like neurodivergence and eating and helping you cultivate a better relationship with your food. And she's a dietitian, so she knows what she's talking about. And then if y'all want to learn more about the research aspect, I do also have something like that. It's both of us in our links in our bios.
Yes.
So
yes.
So that is the best way to support what I do because everything I do here is free, and that's also where you get a lot of information about how to actually practically take the research that I say, and you get early access to different research papers, and it's really fun there. You get a community space, same in yours too.
Yes.
And then if any of y'all here are interested in me speaking at your company about neurodivergence, or if you want to get like a CEU, if you're a therapist or a dietitian and your company offers that, send them my way and I will be able to talk. And then you probably won't have to pay for it if your company pays for it.
I want a CEU from you. That sounds so cool.
Maybe Soon I'll be doing one that I can sell. Maybe.
Yeah, that'd be so cool.
But yeah, that is everything. Thanks so much for joining all y'all. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. I hope you were able to get something out of it that helps you understand how to cultivate more of that bodily intuition with hunger cues, fullness cues, and a lot of those other experiences that we have with food and ADHD. The best thing you can do to support me is through subscribing and liking this video if you are on YouTube, or if you're listening to it on the podcast, please be sure to follow and give it a rate because, again, that just really helps push out this information so more people can see it. And thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.